All right, so today I have the absolute privilege of being joined by Dr. Mike Joy, a freshwater ecologist and environmental scientist, researcher and author, a senior researcher at the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies at Victoria University of Wellington, and a real climate crisis environmental champion and a real hero of mine and someone I look up to and admire for all your hard work. So Mike, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time on a big day to come and talk to all our listeners.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me.
Mike, I wanted to start, before we get right into it, I'm just asking what kind of was the tipping point for you to really get stuck into all these issues. I remember hearing on another podcast that you did that I think you went to university to study these issues when you were around 33. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, I was a late starter. And it was just I guess it was just a time when, I lived through a time when you could just change jobs like you were changing your undies. You got sick of a job at lunchtime, you walked down the road and got another one because there was so much employment around. And then around the early 90s, things started getting a bit harder, and I started getting really bored with the kind of things that I was doing. And so the opportunity came up to a friend had a house in Bulls near Palmerston North, and it was falling down, and we could have it for nothing, so we could live pretty cheaply. And my partner Ellie and I both decided to go to uni, not realizing that we would both spend the next 10 years there. But I had never thought about going to university. No one in my family, no one I knew went to university. So that was a real novelty and a real crunch change of life when we did it too.
And what was it that made you get into this world of the wider world of environmental studies in particular?
Well, I guess that I was interested in science, and particularly, I'm not sure. I was a keen trout fisherman, and one of my first jobs was as a dairy farmer, and I'd seen some of the huge impacts at that time on the Manawatu River. I was farming near the Manawatu River and used to go down there trout fishing, and these great big bergs of foam would come floating down from the dairy factory and meatworks just upstream. And there was just a whole series of things that drove me towards freshwater, plus some really inspiring lecturers at Massey that kind of swung me in that direction as well.
It's so easy for the majority of us to be blind to all these things. So it's I can see that process, how when you see the results of what's happening firsthand, it would draw you towards wanting to work in that space. Often it's like that's an obvious thing where you can see it, but most of the harm is not. We can't see it. It's like carbon in the atmosphere and methane and nitrate in our water. Most of the really big issues are the ones that we don't see, and so people tend not to get fired up about them. But once you work in this space, and I don't know where it came from, but kind of for me a sense of justice or injustice, anger at injustice, and that's always driven me as well. The idea that a few can do so much harm for all, and wanting to highlight those things is part of my motivation as well. And that's where it really comes through in your work. And as someone who's studied this more and more over the last couple of years, I similar to you, spend a lot of time in a place of outrage and despair. But I find it's really hard to convince people in my wider circle to care about these issues. It's a climate crisis is so much more than just a bit of sea level rise and some dying coral. But it's a challenge for all of us to convey the issues in a way that resonates with people. But what would you say to people that sort of don't care enough about this at the moment, or have you got any sort of conversation points that you find work when you're talking to people that aren't that worried or aren't as worried as they should be?
No, it's a really tricky one. I think that we tend to not want to know bad news. We want to be positive, and there's so much pressure, telling people that they have to be positive all the time. And there's, in the same way that I think it's another thing. It's very hard to have serious conversations now. It's sort of frowned upon. Everyone has to be, light and airy and, good, serious over dinner,
not fights, but serious discussions seem to be out of fashion, and which is a real shame because we just don't talk about these issues. I mean, if people, it's so, and it must be the same for you once you know this stuff and you see the passion of people at sports games. You know, how many people will go to a sports game and dress up and scream and yell, and the passions run really, really deep. And it's just chasing a ball round, and yet the really important things, the things that are going to crucially important for their lives and their children's lives, just seem to be, you know, completely forgotten, which is, you know, that's the really frustrating part of it, I guess.
Yeah, and it's connecting those dots that, you know, the repercussions of inaction, you know, and what that will mean for our children and their children and our own lives in 20, 30 years time as well. And even, you know, we're starting to see impacts already. So even in the very close coming years ahead, in a personal sense, it's kind of a big question, but, you know, what scares you the most? What gives you the most, what causes the most despair and outrage for you?
I can there are lots of things make me angry, but this whole, you know, getting onto net emissions, you know, the way we delude ourselves and people collude in business to delude us and to help us delude ourselves. And so we have this frustrating game where people talk, and New Zealand's really bad at it too, talking about net emissions. You know, this kind of idea that somehow we can mitigate fossil carbon that was released, you know, that was sequestered over 200 million years, ending about 65 million years ago. Somehow this idea that we can mitigate that in the current carbon cycle, when this took, you know, more than a couple of hundred million years of carbon cycles. And so it's idiotic in the extreme to think that we can do that in the current cycle. I mean, we replant every single tree and fix up every wetland and put all the carbon back into the soil that we've lost. And then all we would do is be back at square one again. We haven't accounted for a single kilogram of fossil carbon. So, and I just get angry because and the whole same with the whole renewable energy scam, where this idea that we can just, you know, somehow make all this magic renewable energy to replace this one-off bonanza of the most energy dense free fossil fuel energy that we ever had is just as idiotic. And what makes me mad about it is that what it means is that people won't change. They won't see the seriousness of what's happening, and they won't change because it looks, and they keep hearing headlines every other day about how renewable energy is powering the world and how we can talk about net emissions by 2030, and we have all these companies declaring that they're carbon neutral when it's just so much spin and lies. But it makes people feel better, and so they won't make the changes that they need to.
Makes it easy to cling on to that, and you constantly fed with information like, you know, we're doing great in New Zealand, and, you know, 70 to 80% of our electricity is renewable, and our farms aren't that bad, and you know, our food has a lower carbon footprint than anywhere else in the world, and we'll get into some, you know, stats that you've helped voice and share that sort of counteract that a little bit later on, like the threatened indigenous species and things. But what you're mentioning leads us really well into a recent article that you wrote about how this idea of green growth is flawed, and that you know, what we really need to do is find ways of using and wasting less energy, and that resonated so well with me, the idea, you know, and it's taken me a little while to learn this, but that, you know, it takes energy to extract energy. Even wind turbines and solar fields take a lot of fossil fuel driven energy just to be created and extracted. You know, we have to find a way to consume less and waste less energy. And that's a really healthy thing for people too. You know, this idea of just living a more minimalist life in general is good for mental health. But there's some sort of common examples of excessive consumption or sort of energy waste, either on a large scale or a small scale, that drive you wild, that drive you crazy.
Yeah, well, I mean the whole tourism thing is an example of that. That's, you know, that the energy we have a very short window of time to get rid of fossil fuels to have a hope of surviving climate change and all the other crises that are coming at us. and yet there's still, people, I don't know whether it will actually happen. I mean, COVID's kind of, thrown a spanner into the whole works, but if we hadn't had COVID, then we would still have hundreds of cruise ships coming here, and thousands and thousands of plane loads of people flying in here and all around the world just for fun, using up the last of these precious things that we need to be able to, transition into a carbon-free world. So, that's sort of, I guess, trying to think of it like a life raft, that the ship sunk and we're all in a life raft, and we've only got a certain amount of food and water left. And, if you just carry on living like you were when the cruise ship was going in your life raft, you'll very, very quickly have no future. And we're sort of in the life raft now, but people still want to keep eating all the food at this rate they were before, and having showers with the last of the water, when we, we really, really should be, if we care about our future and our kids' future, we should be cutting back on all of that wasteful stuff and using what energy we have left, what, almost free fossil energy we have left, to make our homes, so they don't require energy. Passive solar homes, really, really go hard on insulation and changing our land use to growing food, real food, not fake food like we are at the moment, not rubbish. So, I mean, that's the kind of serious change that we need to make, and yet there's just no mention of it at all. Everyone just carries on as if there's no tomorrow.
On that note, where can anyone listening to this go to find good information that, that isn't just sort of industry greenwashing? I first of all would mention, of course, they should follow yourself, Dr. Mike Joy on Facebook, where you share a lot of really, really insightful educational information. It's also often quite easy to digest too. And also you've written a number of articles on theconversation.com. Which is seems to be a good sort of well-rounded kind of website. Is there anywhere else that you'd recommend people go to get better educated about what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation. I'm surprised how few people realize know about the conversation, and you can sign up and get a newsletter, so you get those alerts every day of all the new stuff. Some brilliant stuff. It's kind of a place for people who haven't heard of it. It's a place where academics can write their findings in a sort of user-friendly form, non-academic form, and then, I mean, they still are all referenced and all the good information's there, but a bit more palatable for the average person on this the conversation website. And they always have fantastic links to the actual articles and to all of the supporting data. So that's a good place to go. I think, to get the climate and the sort of where we are in the world situation and understand the importance of energy and all that kind of thing, I recommend Nate Hagens, N-A-T-E, Nate, H-A-G-N-E-N-S. Just Google him and you'll find he's got some fantastic video clips and things, and he's heaps of podcasts, and he's really up with the play, and he's someone who's come from a corporate background and then done a PhD in science, and really can see all the connections. There's another local one from Tasmania, Damn the Matrix, is another website where you can get lots of this information. I mean, these are just kind of places that, like Damn the Matrix, pull together information from all around the world. I recommend following Alice Friedman on Facebook, and she's got a website as well. But you'll find that a lot of these things are linked together on these websites. So there's a bunch of Tims who are really good. Tim Jackson, the economist, Tim Watkins, who's a UK-based researcher who puts out lots of this kind of thing. I mean, I could pull together a list of them, and you could put them up on your webpage maybe for people to take a look at. I just don't have them all in front of me at the moment.
No, that's a great list, and I'll start by putting all of those in the show notes and in the blog post that goes with this too. And I'll send that to you afterwards, and feel free to
I can add to them. Yeah, great.
That you want as well. But that's huge. That's it's a couple of names that I haven't heard of myself, so I'm really keen to go and check those out. just a note on this kind of consumption sort of question. So many people I know, they kind of define their life by these steps in consumption and material goals. And, you get a bit of this sort of energy from people where they're like, but I've worked hard for a new car. I've worked hard for this, 2-week holiday where I fly all the way to the UK, for 10 days on holiday. Is there anything you find yourself saying to people that or that you would say to people like that, that would sort of hopefully sort of bust this consumption bubble or get people out of the space where they define their success on collecting things?
Yeah, I want to, I often try to get people to think about where that comes from and get them to realize just how much marketing is telling them that, that the whole world is saturated with marketing and advertising and convincing them that, product placement in movies and all of that kind of thing. I think, guys wanting to drive around in great big black 4-wheel drive things didn't just come out of the blue. That came out of the movies. That's where the cool dudes in the movies have vehicles like that, and then every young guy in New Zealand has to have one after that, or in the world actually. And so I want people to think about how they're marketed and how they're conned by all this kind of stuff. And I think that another way to think about the reality is to think about that idea of energy slaves and how fossil fuels are so incredibly cheap because, and the way to think about how that, to put it into something that you can understand, I think energy slaves are good. So you take, say, a barrel of oil or a tank of gas in your car, and if you work out the amount of energy that's in there and then convert it to human energy, and the way to do that is to, if you go to the gym, switch the running machine or the rowing machine or whatever you're on. Most of them have an output that will measure your energy flow, the energy you're transmitting into that device in watts, which is the flow of energy. And you can, and if you row hard or run hard, you'll get around 100 watts. And so that flow of energy you can easily convert into how much energy is in a barrel of oil and how that would relate, like how far would you have to run to equal that amount of energy. And what it works out to is somewhere between 4 and 10 years worth of human energy that you get in one barrel of oil or tank of gas. So a barrel of oil still has to be had a lot of energy put into refining it, but think of the car. There's 4 years worth of human energy that you pay $100 for. And so if you plus that human is, so it's like a slave. You've just bought a slave that's working for you for 4 years in that tank of gas. And so if you work that out at an hourly rate, you're paying him less than a cent an hour. So then you convert that and you look at, all of your energy use, and the average New Zealander is somewhere between 200 and 300 full-time human equivalent slaves we have working for us, and we pay almost nothing for them. And somehow we're oblivious to this. Economists are oblivious to it, that most of them, I mean, that everything we talk about is productivity and all the activity. Look around you, look at the buildings, look at the roads, the houses, everything completely dependent on fossil fuels that we paid virtually nothing for. And so then we're going to go to this this future, and it has to be very soon, where that's out of the equation. So this incredibly cheap, incredibly energy dense fuel will no longer be available. And we're going to, so there's no way that we can carry on living like we are at the moment without that. And anything that we replace it with, of course, requires all of these fossil fuels to be able to build it in the first place. So it's the whole way we think of success and what we deserve and don't deserve is going to change very, very suddenly. You just kind of have to realize that we have been effectively for the last 100 years, maybe a little bit longer, like in a big party, just a crazy wasteful energy party where we had this one-off legacy, and it's like some auntie dying and leaving you a fortune, and then you just have a party to end all parties, and you've blown all the money now, and you've got this huge mess that you have to try and clean up. So you know, I think that's the kind of a way of framing it so that people can think about you know, what they value in life and what's important in life and the changes that are coming.
Such a nice way to, such an effective way to talk about it. You know, our material lifestyles have been subsidized by you know, this incredibly cheap energy for so long. And it's built into kind of expectations. You know, we expect to be able to fly to London for $1,000 and to be able to buy a new car and fill it up for $70, and that can drive us all over the country. But nothing factors in the kind of, I guess, the extrinsic costs of all this consumption.
And we're, you know, I mean, it's our lifetime, so we think that it's a long time, but it's just a blink of an eyelid in the time that humans have been on the planet. And so it's not like, it's completely unprecedented, the levels of consumption that we have. You know, nothing's ever dominated the planet like we are at the moment. So you know, it's not something that you can look in history. You can't look backwards and see anything like this. This has never happened before.
Mike, I'd love to touch on your work on freshwater, if we do have time, and I know that's where a lot of your passion and your hard work lies. Tell us a bit more about freshwater, which is kind of one of these invisible. You know, you look at the water coming out of your tap, obviously, and you look at our rivers, and they sort of, on the face of it, sort of look clean, but in your work you've found that that's really not the case, and when you look into it, it's actually friggin' scary as hell. Tell us a bit more about that.
Okay, so, you know, I touched on it before, that you can't see the worst things. Just like you can't see carbon in the atmosphere, you can't see nitrate in our rivers, and that's one of the biggest issues for us, because we drink that water as well. And there's just more and more evidence coming out of the impacts of nitrate on human health and ecosystem health, and just how harmful it is. And we've kind of ignored it in a way. But it does relate to a bigger global issue, which is very much related to climate change. It's another one of the crises, one of the planetary boundaries that we've exceeded by, you know, huge amounts, and that is how we've altered the nitrogen cycle. And I guess the average person on the street would have no idea about this, but that almost 100 years ago, we as in humans found a way to use fossil fuels to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground via fertilizer and boost plant growth, so food production. And it's often referred to as the green revolution, and it's kind of I think an arrogance of humans to think that we somehow, you know, massively increased production through our cleverness and our technology, when actually we just altered hugely a natural cycle using this one-off, you know, fossil fuel bonanza. And what we did was massively increase the population because of this extra food availability. And we now produce synthetically more synthetic nitrogen fertilizer than all of natural systems put together. And so we've changed this, you know, cycles like nitrogen, carbon, all those things were in a form, in more or less equilibrium, and that's how it's been for millions of years. And then we've really taken these things out of equilibrium, and so we've altered the cycle, and now more than half of the cells in our bodies, the nitrogen, and more than half the cells in the bodies of any human pretty much on the planet are from synthetic nitrogen. So it's stuff that we've created, and that has had huge and is having huge effects on ecosystems, because now we have nitrate in fresh water and lakes and rivers and the ocean at much higher levels than we ever had before. And the atmosphere, I mean, you can measure it just in parts per million like you can carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've massively increased it because we're making this reactive nitrogen, taking it out of its cycle. And so this is where we see it in the, so we put it on the paddocks to grow grass, in our case, to grow grass so we can feed the cows. But most of the nitrate doesn't go out with the milk. It stays, it gets excreted from the cow via the urine and then ends up going into our waterways, our groundwater, and lakes and oceans.
And we have a sort of, I think it's the World Health Organization sort of recommended safe level of around 11.3 milligrams per liter of water is kind of considered the safe amount of nitrates in the water. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the old, and this came in the 1950s. This is the drinking water standard, and it comes from some research which isn't all that conclusive, but like a lot of these limits, they were just, back in the day, and that was a stab in the dark. They had to put a number to something, and so they stuck it in there, and it was related to what's known as the blue baby syndrome. And so, for that first few months of a baby's life, when it's sort of adapting to its own oxygen rather than its mother's through the bloodstream, then it's susceptible to nitrogen binding with the hemoglobin instead of hemoglobin, and the baby running out of oxygen. So it was only ever there for one, sort of effect, and nobody knew about the bunch of other impacts that have come out since then, where nitrate's found to be related to colorectal cancer, premature births, some thyroid cancers and things like that. So increased nitrate in our diets, whether it's through water or through food, is known to be carcinogenic, and in water it's at much lower levels than that drinking water, 11.3 milligrams.
And there was you referenced this Danish study that linked nitrate levels in water to higher rates of colorectal cancer, and New Zealand just happens to have one of the highest bowel cancer rates in the world.
Yes.
And they found this Danish study found a significant increase in colorectal cancer risk at just 0.87 was that parts per million or
parts per million and milligrams per liter. That's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay.
So the Danish study was millions and millions of people, a very robust piece of work, but there's also been a meta-analysis of American studies as well that's found similar levels in the US over big populations as well. So it's this, and it's not a separate issue. I mean, we know that colorectal cancer or bowel cancer is related also to nitrites in meat, so processed meat, and there's definitely a relationship between those things and smoking. So all of these things are additive, and so if you smoke and then you eat that and high levels of that processed meat, and you drink water with high levels of nitrate, then they all add on to each other and become increased risk. So just the drinking water nitrate alone works out to significant increase at less than 1 milligram, and a 15% increase in risk at 2.1 milligrams, that's from the Danish study as well. And so, I mean, it's the Danish study. It was just happened that it's a country, a well-off country that had a nitrate-intensive farming problem from intensive farming and horticulture, and so they realized it and they did something about it. But of course, these things take a long time to get out of the system, and so they had this massive data set of nitrate levels for water because they kept good records, and cancer rates in humans. It's harder to do in New Zealand, and we are working on that because New Zealanders move around so much, and this is a lifetime accumulation thing. So it's very hard to link. Nitrate levels in drinking water are very variable around New Zealand, and so if you're moving around, you're seeing different levels of it.
What can listeners do if they are concerned about their own water quality
well, the places to be worried about, and this is just a generalization, but it's the intensively farmed parts of New Zealand, where in the lower areas where the nitrate levels are high. So if your drinking water is coming from groundwater, Canterbury, South Canterbury, those kind of areas, you can look on your regional council websites and you'll get some kind of feel for what's going on. We've just got a paper. I'm working with a bunch of researchers from Otago School of Medicine, and a really awesome master student that I had, Jane Richards, who pulled together data on drinking water for 4 million New Zealanders. That's basically all the registered water supplies in New Zealand, and about 800,000 of those exceed the 0.87 milligram level. So that, you know, that's a big chunk of New Zealanders that are receiving that drinking water with concerning nitrate levels.
Sam, that's huge.
Yeah, it's huge, and it's scary because it's completely unnecessary. But the thing that I feel really awkward because I don't want to recommend to people that they buy bottled water. We have looked at bottled water, got another paper going out on that soon, and bottled water mostly is very low in nitrate. But I really, and this is one of these things that makes me incredibly angry, is that because New Zealand government and governments over many years have refused or neglected to do anything about water ownership issues in New Zealand, we have this infamous nobody owns water, John Key's famous nobody owns water line. So what that means is that and it is in reality not just a theory, that you can come to New Zealand, you can be a transnational company, say Coca-Cola, come to New Zealand and get the water for nothing, just pay a one-off consent fee, and then help yourself to massive amounts of water, stick it in plastic bottles, sell it to New Zealanders,
sell it back to us.
Sell it back to us in plastic bottles, most of them with these stupid nipple things on them, which is a whole lot of unnecessary plastic as well. I just, is it some kind of, you know, mother's breast thing that people feel like they have to have one of these nipple things on the end of a bottle of water before they can drink it? That drives me nuts as well. But the whole idea that we take, you know, that because we have high nitrate levels because governments have failed to do anything about intensification of agriculture. Governments have failed to do anything about water ownership. So these other people can come and help themselves to our best water. They don't want the stuff we get out of the tap. They get the best from really deep bores that haven't been contaminated yet and sell it to us. So, you know, coming back to your question, I don't want to tell people to go and buy bottled water, but you know, I suggest catching water off the roof. You know, anyone who lives in a you know, a dwelling that's got a roof on it can do that, and you know, you have to be careful if there's potential for contamination from birds. But pretty much that's the alternative to buying bottled water, and it won't be a problem for, you know, obviously the people that weren't in that 800,000 in New Zealand don't have a problem. But it's something that we do have to worry about. It's a failure of government, and we have to be, you know, finding our way out of it. But we definitely need to make sure we do something about who owns freshwater in New Zealand. There is a Waitangi Tribunal claim from the Māori councils put together, Y2358, on water ownership, and I'm just not sure it's been through part of the process, and I think that governments just try to avoid this because they, you know, obviously it's going to be a hugely political issue, sorting out water ownership. So I'm not expecting that to change anytime soon, but I'm hoping that if the Waitangi Tribunal claim goes through, then some pressure can be put on the government to do something about it.
Thanks, mate. That's great tip about the roof water. You referenced this sort of intensification of agriculture in New Zealand, and this being part of the issue with these nitrate levels.
Yeah.
On that, sort of connected to that, you recently shared an article I wrote on New Zealand's palm kernel extract imports. And a lot of people, another thing that so many people wouldn't know is that we are the world's largest importer of palm kernel extract. We import 2 million, or we're estimated to import 2 million tons of it this year to feed our cows. And this was based on, you know, some work that you had done on your Freshwater for Life website, which I'd encourage people to check out as well, and which I'll link to in the show notes. I was really shocked when I found out about that. Like, you know, heartbroken. And are there other examples like this of practices, or, you know, or sort of things that are going on that most Kiwis wouldn't know about, where they've just kind of escalated over the last 20, 30 years and just gotten to the point where seemingly just out of hand. One example, and maybe this is one you want to talk to, but I listened to you say in a recent interview that New Zealand has the highest proportion of threatened indigenous species in the world. That blew my mind, and so thank you for sharing that and voicing that. But yeah, would you like to talk to that a bit more, or are there any other sort of signs that blow your, that people should know about?
Yeah, it's really shocking. I mean, I kind of, in my lectures and public talks that I do, it's kind of, I keep wheeling out these figures, and then I get so used to saying that then every now and again it slaps me in the face that just how extreme it is. So yeah, we have, if you take all of our native species, we have the highest rates of threatened and at-risk species of any country in the world proportionally. When it comes to freshwater, then our native fish and our freshwater mussel and crayfish, the highest rates I can find anywhere in the world, about 75%. So 3/4 of our native fish are threatened or at risk, and like I said, our mussel and our crayfish as well. And when it comes to shocking statistics, that the palm kernel one is a shocker. The nitrate is another shocker. I don't know if you've seen, that paper that we published recently. On its title is something like Shifting Baselines and Political Expediency, where we talk about Adam Canning and I talking about our experience with Ministry for the Environment over setting limits and how the baselines keep shifting in this country. But there's a graph in there that shows nitrate levels, the flux of nitrogen in a bunch of rivers globally, and you'll see that New Zealand rivers are up there amongst the worst in the world for the amount of nitrogen that's in them. So and then there's another great paper that I can also give you a link to that's available free online, a big study of the environmental performance of countries in the world, and you'll see there that we come out, overall, including water quality and a bunch of other measures, we're about 20th from the worst in the world of 180 odd countries. So we're not in the top quarter or top half, or we're in the bottom 20th percentile of countries in the world when it comes to environmental performance. I think people are taken in by our clean green marketing to some extent, and we really think we are clean when we're actually really, really far from clean and green. And and if you look at the other input to farming, intensive farming, then that's phosphate, and the phosphate fertiliser. I don't know if you've seen this as well, but we are the only people importing phosphate from the Western Sahara, and there's a whole Western Sahara, there's a huge kind of ethical and social issues around the ownership of that phosphate that we're buying from the Moroccans, who I don't want to get sued by the Moroccans here, but there is definitely issues over the ownership of it. It's called blood phosphate. There's a lot of information about how it's being stolen off the indigenous people of West Sahara, and where every other country in the world has decided not to, on ethical grounds, not to touch this blood phosphate, but we still do. About 4 shiploads a year coming to here, and it made the news a couple of years ago because one of the ships called into South Africa to bunker and had a writ nailed to the mast because it was the sort of like stolen goods, and it should not have been being transferred. So we're part of that as well. There's everywhere you look. We've kind of kid ourselves that we're this lovely clean, green, ethical country, but underneath it, look under the mat, and there's some really horrible stuff going on.
And it's, I've heard you reference this before, but it's, a lot of, it seems like a lot of farmers almost get forced into this with, really high debt levels and pressure to produce more. So, it's, when I've listened to you talk before, it's not about sort of beating up on farmers. It's kind of like the system is kind of is broken and
no, I don't want to beat up on farmers because they're the ones getting beat up on by the system, Fonterra is a good example where I can't even blame Fonterra for this, but the act that they were set up under that meant that they had to take milk, the DIRA Act, Dairy Industry Regulation. So the company, over this time, 30 years of intensification, if anyone wanted to start providing milk to Fonterra, they had to take it regardless of where it was or whether they wanted it or not. And their defense mechanism, and this is natural kind of business sense, was that every new supplier, the money that they paid for their shares would be spent on buying more drying capacity, because nearly all of the milk produced in this country is dried into milk powder for export. And so they've built all these dryers, and so now they have this massive drying capacity, and there's no way they're going to want to reduce the volume of milk, that they can afford to reduce the volume of milk coming in. So all of this talk about reducing intensity and all that kind of thing, I mean, that strikes fear into the heart of Fonterra or the fertiliser companies that are doing very well out of supplying the phosphate and the nitrate and everything else that goes into farming intensively. And so, yeah, the poor old farmers getting pushed in one direction. We need more production all the time. And it's kind of like, it's the old rat on the wheel. They just run faster and faster and stay in the same place because, as they run faster, the costs go up. They have to, pay more and more for the inputs that are going into their thing. Yeah. Then there's the land values going up, based on the right to pollute, because you had governments and regional councils that have done nothing about intensification. Then there's been a huge land value increase, which means the right to pollute has been capitalized into the land value. And so when you come along, and if a government was to be brave enough to come along and say, right, we're going to limit intensification to protect our lakes and rivers, then that land would suddenly be worth nowhere near what the farmer paid for it. And considering that we have, close to $40 billion worth of debt on dairy farms, then you're going to set up a huge economic crash if you were to stop that harm that's being done. So, I really, really don't blame the farmers at all. And some of my best friends are dairy farmers, and I know how they're caught up in this system, and it's just so wrong. But it's the industry and the failures of government that are driving it, not the farmers.
Imagine it just keeps perpetuating. If you imagine a young farmer trying to take over a farm or get their first one, if they're buying it at these really high prices that are fueled by all this cheap fertilizer, then they've got to get a return on that investment and all the debt that they've taken on. So they're driven to kind of carry on the same intense practices. Yeah,
they are, and it's not just driven by the fertilizer; it's driven by the government and the local, first the government, and the failure by the regional council. I mean, Canterbury's a great example of that. The conversion of that land to dairy meant a massive increase in the value of those properties, and the value of the property is totally linked to them being allowed to pollute. And there's plenty of figures around. There's an article I can give you a link to where I put the numbers together on the Radio New Zealand website, and it's just so clear that we are subsidising this harmful practice on farms in New Zealand, and that makes it impossible. Well, not impossible, but very, very difficult for farmers to be able to change in the right direction and reduce intensity when we're basically subsidising the harm that's being done and the costs are not being paid.
Mike, I appreciate so much all the time you've taken today. But it was a really eye-opening conversation. I think a lot of new knowledge for people, which will really help them, galvanize their thoughts around this and just kind of have a better understanding of why they should care and why they should give mental energy to these issues. I'll let you go on this. What can people do to help? What are some things that you do personally? What are some things that our listeners could do to help in any small way? To be part of the solution.
Well, yeah, from an individual point of view, I think I think how you live and how you consume is really, really important. And so not eating meat is a really, really good start, or reducing the amount of meat that you eat, because there are huge environmental issues, greenhouse gas and otherwise involved in that. There's probably not much point in changing, not going away from dairy, apart from good health reasons, but because 90% of what's produced on, and milk wise is dried and sent off overseas to be a breast milk replacement or junk food filler, not buying milk's not going to make any difference to what happens in New Zealand around there. So really, to make a difference is your consumption. Don't, obviously for all sorts of reasons, just getting over that I have to have more toys kind of lifestyle. But I think also getting active and speaking up and writing letters to editors and getting involved in submissions and really putting pressure on government to not, just to do something rather than just keep on failing like they have been over protecting our environment. We really need to give them a shake up, and so how you vote and getting involved in regional council and local body politics as well is really important too.
Reminds me of a quote I wanted to mention, which I heard you say in another podcast, which was that our rent for living on this planet is to be active, i.e., to be activists.
Yep.
I love that so much. And another one you said as well was to beware the weapons of mass distraction.
Yeah. I mean, I sort of talked about the weapons of mass distraction, I guess, with sports, but yeah, I mean, that's, if we could just be 5% as passionate about our world and our environment and our futures as we are about sport, which is a massive weapon of mass distraction. But advertising and all of the other stuff where we lock ourselves away in virtual worlds and lose that connection with the real world is all part of the distraction that allows this bad stuff to happen. So getting rid of a lot of that kind of stuff out of your life is really important as well.
Beautifully said, Mike, and it's a real privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so much for your time. Keep up the amazing work. I'll share links to all those articles mentioned and other resources or places people can go for advice in the show notes. And I look forward to watching all your good work continue, in the years ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Nice to talk.